Thank you all so much for being here. It's exciting to see a room full of people who are interested in hearing about Joan Mitchell and second-wave feminism. I'm Sarah Roberts. I'm Senior Director of Curatorial Affairs for the Joan Mitchell Foundation, and I previously was a museum curator and had the privilege of organizing with my colleague Katie Siegel the retrospective of Joan Mitchell that traveled to Paris to the Fondation Louis Vuitton. That is how I became deeply involved with Mitchell, and of course now very happy to be working with the foundation. And our event here this evening is part of the centennial celebrations of Joan Mitchell. She was born in 1925, and the foundation has programmed the year with some talks, some events. We'll have an exhibition in New York City at David's Werner Gallery later this year. And you can see all of these activities we have a page on our website dedicated to the centennial, and I invite you to take a look there, particularly at a map. One of our big initiatives was to ask museums around the world that have works by Joan Mitchell to put them on view so that people can see them in their home communities and the museums where these paintings live permanently. And I'm happy to say more than 100 museums around the world have works on view. So I invite you to take a look at the map and plan a trip to go see a Joan Mitchell work in person. I want to start by thanking the whole team here at WARE, Camille, of course, and her incredible team, and Lauren and Carolina, who have worked closely with us for their partnership in producing this event. It's been a great partnership, and we hope to continue it. A few words about the Joan Mitchell Foundation and our mission. Half of our mission is to steward the legacy of Joan Mitchell. We have a collection of her works, we have her archives, we work closely with scholars and curators on research projects and exhibitions and publications. And we have a Resonate project underway as well. I have two of my colleagues here from the foundation, Chris Blatchford, who's the executive director, and Mary Hoberman, who's a researcher with Federal Resonate based here in France. And the other half of the foundation provides direct support to living artists. This comes directly from Mitchell's wishes in establishing the foundation from the very beginning in 1993. We provide support in the form of fellowships and an artist residency program to living artists. So this comes really from Mitchell's own interest during her life in supporting young artists, writers, composers, particularly young women. Among our long-term goals in support of the mission is to establish a greater presence and deeper relationships here in France. Of course, Mitchell spent much of her life here, so we are working hard this year, but as a long-term goal to establish closer connections, collaborations, and support research and publications and exhibitions in the future generated by French and European scholars. We're particularly interested in projects that consider the social and political context around Mitchell, hence our topic this evening. And we're thrilled to be able to partner with the WARE and to gather the scholars who you'll hear from shortly to talk about Mitchell in the context of second-wave feminism. We see this as kind of an opening conversation. We hope that maybe some scholars at the table, maybe some of you in this room, will pursue this line of inquiry in future projects. To set the stage, I want to share a short quote from a letter by Joan Mitchell. She wrote to her sister in 1973, shortly after a visit from Marcia Tucker, who was a curator known for her feminist activism. And she was, at the time, working with Mitchell to plan a solo exhibition that would take place at the Whitney in 1974. Mitchell, in letters at this time, routinely referred to Marcia Tucker as Miss Whitney. And she starts the letter by referring to herself in the third person. She says, quote, "Joan feels Miss Whitney is using her for women's liberation. Shirley and Zuka figure ephemal and get the pics on the wall." F being the expletive that's ridiculous. So it's a quote that really unfolds, it's funny, but it also unfolds several layers of thinking in thinking about the exhibition. She expresses skepticism about the entire project, while she's also leaping at the opportunity. She mentions her friends, Shirley Jaffe and Zuka Middleburg, also both painters, Americans living in the US. She'd clearly been talking with them about the situation with Marcia Tucker, and they offered energetic support and directed her to get on with it. There's a reluctance, clearly, to be associated with Tucker's feminist project, and Mitchell had resisted being included in all women exhibitions from the very beginning of her career, seeing that as the ultimate marginalization. But she began to relent in the late 60s and early 70s and to allow her work to be included as she began to understand the impact that these shows could have on younger women artists, and she began to appreciate being seen as someone who had paved the way and who offered support to other women. Just turn that off now, so I'm sorry, but she reflected on this role later in her life. One of the documentaries is screening downstairs by Marion Pajori. I'm going to paraphrase just to keep it tight, but she says, "Oh, lots of women write me and say, 'Oh, Joan, you've made it possible for women to show. I hope I've helped, and I certainly try and encourage or get galleries for young women. I'm a little prejudiced. I think a man could make it anyway if he's any good, but I think women need a sort of kick in the pants and a lot of encouragement.'" So as you can see, she had complex and often conflicting thoughts about her own position as a woman artist. I'm eager to hear from our panelists this evening, all of whom have done important thinking and research about Mitchell, and to hear their thoughts about the arc of Mitchell's relationship with feminism and how feminist methodologies can continue to open new avenues for understanding her work. Thank you all very much. They will be introduced shortly, and I will hand it back to you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Sarah, for your kind words. So, my name is Camille Rino. I'm a co-founder and director of Aware, and it's a great pleasure to see you and have the opportunity to host this wonderful event, part of Joan Mitchell's centennial celebration, as you say, Sarah. So we're actually really honored to have been chosen by you as a place and a partner. Because you have such a dedicated and precise vision about what an artist foundation should be. And I have to say I'm really admirative of that, as I told you. This event further strengthened the links between our two structures. And the idea for this collaboration was born well over a year ago, and that's why I'm saying it's a curated line of events. When Sarah, Krista, and other members of the Joan Mitchell Foundation first came to Villa Vassiliev, and throughout the process of developing this roundtable, it's been a delight to work with the foundation, and we truly appreciate your support. Now, I have a bit of personal history with Joan Mitchell that I may have told you. When I curated the L exhibition in Centre Pompidou in 2009, which, as you probably know, showed only women artists in a permanent collection for nearly 2 years, so we literally pushed to women artists. Joan Mitchell was the first room, and Centre Pompidou has a wonderful collection of Joan Mitchell, and I remember walking through that room nearly every day to give tours of L, and it was a difficult moment because at the time women artists were not an easy thing to talk about or even to show as a group. But she gave me the strength somehow when I went through that room to go through it and help me through the process. So you have to remember that as an art historian, artists are an inspiration. They give us strength. So now, for those of you who are visiting the Villa Vassiliev for the first time, I wanted to begin with a few words about Aware. It is a non-profit organization which I co-founded in 2014 in order to remedy the lack of accessible information about women artists. It's NGOs, and the goal is the creation, indexation, and distribution of information on women artists from the 70s to the 21st centuries, from all over the world and across all disciplines. So it's absolutely crazy project. And it's been nearly crushing me for the last 10 years, thanks to partnerships such as the one we have tonight. So it is fitting that the event tonight should be held here, as we're not only in Aware's headquarters and library, surrounded by about 4,000 books on women artists, but also in a building that once housed the studio of Marie Vassiliev, an early 20th century artist who, like Joan Mitchell, came to France from abroad, initially found herself in a loose community of compatriots, and then forged her own independent path among some of the most famous male artists of her time. It was a studio, it was also a canteen, and she held also bal in here, in that exact place, and that's why we're going to drink champagne, because that's the spirit of the place. The question of artists' relation to feminism and feminist views is one we often ask ourselves at AWARE. We know that many of the women artists about whom we publish research and biographies did not necessarily want to be grouped together with other women. And many did not share what we would consider today to be feminist views. In Joan Mitchell, we have a fascinating case of an artist who lived and worked before the second wave of feminists broke, and whose writing and archives, thanks to the wonderful work, again, of the Joan Mitchell Foundation, are accessible in a way that means that we can study the effect that this political event had on her point of view. This will be the topic of discussion of our event this evening, which aims to place the focus back on the artist and her own words. We, as critics, curators, and researchers, often speak for the artist. This is especially common for women artists. This evening, however, we will go back to what traces Joan Mitchell left on this subject and re-examine her words in the context of the second wave feminist movement. Our hope is that this will provide new understanding of this brilliant and complex artist. So before introducing the participant, or rather let my team introduce the participant, I would like to thank everyone who has made this event possible. Krista Blatchford, Executive Director of the Joan Mitchell Foundation. Dear Krista, thank you. Sarah Roberts, Senior Director for Curatorial Affairs of the Joan Mitchell Foundation, and all of their colleagues. And my team here in Paris, especially Manuela Danescu and Matilda Tashiska, who are hiding somewhere. I would particularly like to thank Carolina Hernandez-Munoz and Eleanor Bez, who coordinated this event and will moderate the discussion and also introduce the panelists. So I will not introduce the participant, you will do it, because actually both of them did the actual work. So thank you.
So thank you again, Sarah and Camille, for the introduction. I will introduce our first two speakers, and then I will let Carolina, my colleague, who will also be moderating this evening, introduce the other two. So first is Cora Chalabi. Cora Chalabi is a PhD candidate in history of art at University College London. Her research explores American late modernist painting by women artists, focusing on the work of Joan Mitchell, Alma Thomas, and Helen Frankenthaler. Cora was a fall 2023 visiting scholar at Yale University. Her forthcoming publications include an article in the fall 2025 issue of the Archives of American Journal and a chapter for the Routledge Companion to Contemporary Painting. We also have Flavia Frigeri. Dr. Flavia Frigeri is a curatorial and collections director at the National Portrait Gallery. She has recently guest curated the retrospective of French-Portuguese artist Maria Helena Vieira da Silva at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, Venice, the group exhibition Beyond Form, Lines of Abstraction, 1950 to 1970, in 2024 at the Turner Contemporary in Margate, and All Art Today's 2025, a survey of international contemporary art at MARE in Bucharest, Romania. She has published articles and catalogue essays on post-war Italian art, feminism, exhibition histories, and pop art, and she is the author of Pop Art and Women Artists, both in Clayton Hudson's Art Essentials series.
Thank you. We're also very lucky to have Julia Marchand, who's a Venice-based curator, researcher. She's a curator, or was a curator at the Vincent van Gogh Foundation between 2015 and 2023, and conceived, alongside Wietse Kruger, many exhibitions, including Action, Gesture Painting, Women in Abstraction, A World History, 1940 to 1970, in 2023. And we're lucky to have the catalog just behind us here. She's also the artistic director of Extramondale, and has worked with artists Sara Dimitsa, Anaïs Stoic, Mohamed Bourouissa, and Lisa Yuskavage. She is currently preparing an exhibition on Elia Zadenich and Marcel Duchamp-Spot en Valise at the Fondazione Antonio Dalla Nogare in Bolzano, Italy, as well as a series of podcasts for Projects Media. We also have Virginia Subelite, an associate curator at Peggy Guggenheim Collection. Her recent exhibitions include Surrealism and Magic, Enchanted Modernity, which was held in 2022. 1948, the Biennale of Peggy Guggenheim in 2018, and Rita Kern-Larson, Surrealist Paintings in 2017. She also curated From Gesture to Form, post-war European and American art from the Schulhoff collection. Among other projects, she is currently co-organizing a show, Peggy Guggenheim in London, The Making of a Collector, which will be held in 2026 to 2027 with the Royal Academy of Arts at London, and an exhibition on Hedda Stern. Thank you. And we'll go ahead and get started with Cora.
Perfect. Thank you, Camille, Eleanor, and Carolina. I feel incredibly grateful to be here, and it's just such a fantastic conversation that we're having this evening, and this is the start of a kind of broader and bigger conversation around Joan Mitchell and second wave feminism. And I'd also therefore like to thank the Joan Mitchell Foundation Archive, who since 2022 have really supported the research I've been doing, and a lot of my work tonight draws on their resources. So, to begin. In a 1990 interview with Catherine Lawless, Joan Mitchell powerfully asserted, "I have always felt there was something forbidden for a woman to paint." Mitchell made this statement after almost 4 decades of making distinctly assertive and emphatically painterly paintings, works that have no sense of polite containment, apology, or feminine restraint. Indeed, I argue that Mitchell took to task any notion of the forbidden, of what a woman artist could or could not do. Accordingly, this paper considers what does it mean to offer a feminist reading of Mitchell's work. Moving away from recent debates on if Mitchell was a feminist, I ask where and how we can read feminism into Mitchell's studio practice and abstract paintings. To do this, I draw on extensive archival research, prioritizing Mitchell's own artistic voice. Rejecting narratives that situate Mitchell, often in implicitly gendered terms, as a second-generation follower of abstract expressionism, I reposition her as an artist who deliberately explored the irreverent contradictions within her practice. It is particularly interesting to consider questions of feminism in Mitchell's work, given her unwavering commitment to oil and gestural abstract painting. In Painting Feminism History, feminist art historian Griselda Pollock argues that, in the context of abstract expressionism, gesture unequivocally inscribed the trace of the male artist body and subjectivity into painting. Beginning in the 1960s and 70s, painting in general, and abstract painting in particular, were unmasked as a site of male artistic domination. Feminist artists used performance to refute gesture's associations with male genius and heroism. However, I argue that Mitchell's sustained engagement with gesture as a mode of mark-making can also be seen as a more blatant feminist act of reclamation. In East 9th Street of 1956, Mitchell's title and mode of mark-making locates her presence as a woman and an artist within the specific topography of abstract expressionism, including the groundbreaking 9th Street show of 1951 and Artists' Hangout The Club on 8th Street. Mitchell builds the composition of East 9th Street through layering thin strokes which accentuate the individuality of each mark. Rugged brushstrokes form a passage of deep blue across the lower register of the composition, and rapid swirls of scarlet, white, and Naples yellow suggest the sensation of painting still in motion. Revealingly, in an interview with Eleanor Monroe, Mitchell reflected her goal was to be as successful as the abstract expressionist artist Anne Ryan. Mitchell recalled, "She was a lady painter I admired. I mean, how many are there?" Both in her collages and paintings, Ryan used a softly gestural language of abstraction. Therefore, by using gesture, Mitchell subversively situated herself in dialogue with Ryan as both a lady painter and abstract expressionist. Mitchell can also be seen as using irony as a subversive feminist device within her paintings. In an interview with critic Douglas Davis, Mitchell quipped, "There are 4 kinds of art: pop art, op art, slop art, and flop art. I fall into the last 2 categories." Mitchell's categories constitute a humorous dismissal of contemporaneous approaches to abstraction. In She Changes by Intrigue, Irony, Feminism, and Femininity, theorist Linda Rainford asserts that irony has long been used as an agentic feminist device to question established ideas and negate a structure's value from within. Mitchell's painting Swamp of 1956 illuminates her agentic use of irony. The title parodies the formal language she knowingly adopted within the painting. Intriguingly, Mitchell persistently rejected ideas of accident within her work. For example, in an interview with Irving Sandler, she stressed, "If I saw an accident, I would use it, and then it is no accident." Ostensibly, Swamp appears muddled and mistaken, as if multiple accidents had taken place, thereby submerging the painting's surface. The murky peach, blue, black, orange, and red strokes at the centre of the composition are almost reminiscent of paint squeezed straight from the tube. On the lower register, the broad brush sections of white, brown, and grey echo the swamping of pigments within Mitchell's paint palette. However, on closer looking, Swamp demonstrates Mitchell's use of a structured centripetal composition. The painting is further defined on the left, where Mitchell uses an X motif, and on the lower right, where light brown brushstrokes divide passages of white into rectilinear modules. Belying the painting's ostensibly swamped surface is a careful process of seeing and using mark-making. Viewed through Rainford's theory, Mitchell's identification with slop and flop formed an ironic feminist negation of the use of these terms in framing her work, and more broadly, the value of spontaneous, heroic mark-making in abstract expressionism. Not only did Mitchell's politics inform her paintings, but her studio practice at Le Tour de Toy, where she lived from 1968 until her death in 1992. In A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf argues that for a woman to attain their creative potential, they must possess an autonomous physical space and source of income. In her interview with Eleanor Monroe, Mitchell demonstrated her engagement with Woolf's writing. "Virginia Woolf, I can't bear. I read her until she was coming out of my ears. I was thinking just like her." A Room of One's Own is a pioneering feminist tract and one of Woolf's most important essays. Therefore, if Mitchell read Woolf till she was coming out of her ears, we can infer that she will have read A Room of One's Own and engaged with the essay's feminist principles. Mitchell's studio practice at Le Tour suggests she was thinking like Woolf and acting in accordance. Here, Mitchell possessed both a room of her own in the autonomous outhouse she used as a studio, and had an income from inheritance and sales of her paintings. Mitchell further recalled that where in Paris her partner, Jean-Paul Riopel, and his children, Sylvie and Isseux, were in my studio, living, eating, or always around, after she moved to La Tour, she had a separate place where I can lock the door. It psychologically changed a lot. There are parallels between Mitchell's references to Riopel's family and Woolf's argument that the burdens of children and domestic life restrict women's creativity. The conditions of Mitchell's studio at La Torre illuminate the privilege of having an autonomous private space. It psychologically changed a lot. I would like to close by returning to Mitchell's interview with Catherine Lawless, where she reflected on intersections between her experience as a woman painter and the space of her studio. Mitchell stated, "If I cover the windows of my studio, it is because I do not like to be seen. I feel freer there, hidden. I have always felt there was something forbidden for a woman to paint. In a society, a woman's sensitivity is expected to produce little poems, embroidery, decorative paintings, or cakes. A woman does not have the right to express herself, to exist as a creator, even in her own artistic world." Mitchell's statement illuminates a feminist politic underpinning her decision to both veil the walls of her studio and, more significantly, engage in a private process of painting. As we can see in Robert Frieson's photograph on the left, Mitchell blocked the windows and doors of her studio with unstretched canvas, thereby preventing any natural light or unwanted visitors entering the space. Mitchell's monumental canvases, such as La Grande Vallée de Amaryllis, visible in Frieson's photograph, assert her objective as a woman artist to express herself, to exist as a creator in her artistic world. The painting is built from thick, stabbing polychrome brushstrokes applied wet on wet. Mitchell's emphasis on hiding or veiling within her studio is echoed in the painting. Impasto clumps of green worked into yellow on the upper register of the composition physically suggest the act of concealing within layers of paint. Meanwhile, the scrawled strokes of rose, lilac, and magenta at the centre of the composition form an ironic response to associations of pink with a woman's sensitivity. The titular, amaryllis, could both be a reference to the plant or a more subversive challenge to the historic figuration of lady painters making decorative floral paintings. Emphatically rejecting any associations of the diminutive or decorative through the painting's vast scale and raw composition, Mitchell asserts a transgressive desire to paint and take position as of an artistic world as a woman artist. Throughout this paper, I have argued that Mitchell's paintings and engagement with feminism were at times contradictory. Her politics were not declared overtly, but rather latently manifest within the dense, multi-layered forms of Mitchell's paintings and sites of her studio. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to questions.
Okay, I'll dive straight in. And actually, Cora's paper ties in really nicely with some of the things I wanted to bring to your attention this evening. And the first one, as a starting point, one of the many amazing archival material that the Foundation shared with us included this article by the critic Barbara Rose, which has a rather fantastic title, I must say, First Rate Art by the Second Sex. But what this article does, it shows the two sort of moments. And she starts, as you can see from the opening sentence, she starts by looking back on 1957. And I'm going to read a short quote from this. She says, "In 1957, avant-garde women artists were a pathetic minority, subjected to every kind of social and critical ridicule. Today, and today is 1974, many leading critics are women, the groupies are boy starlets, and the feminist movement has hammered home its point that women are not getting their due in the art world." So she's really seeing like two moments. And the reason why she points our attention to 1957 is because she's referring to a really important article in Life magazine, which included Joan Mitchell alongside Grace Hartigan and Helen Frankenthaler. And they were seen in a way framed as pioneers, but also almost as like
these lonely figures within a world that didn't really conceive of women up until the rise of the feminist movements, when it was, when we were in the framework of art. And what sort of Rose is doing in this article, and she's pointing the attention, and then she goes on and speaks about Mitchell's contemporary retrospective at the Whitney, and she's very celebratory about it. But she's seeing this transition. It's almost before the second wave feminism and then the aftermath of the second wave feminist movements. And what I'm interested in, and the thing I'm going to show you in a minute, is thinking about that pre-feminist moment. And it ties in with what Cora was saying. How do we think of abstraction, actually, which usually is considered like very non-objective, all about form, but actually how we can think of form as being the site of a proto-feminist discourse. And this is where I really see also Mitchell's work fitting in, even though she resisted the idea of feminism, as so many of her contemporaries, in fact. But before we move on to my next slide, I also want to sort of draw your attention to another amazing passage in this article where Rose is sort of like, again, thinking about how in 1974 things are changing. She's feeling very positive. And she says, the balance is shifting and the day is close at hand when a woman will only have qualifications equal to a man's to get the job, win the election, or get the retrospective at MoMA. Don't hold your breath on this one. The Champ in drag is the closest they've come lately. And I think, some of these things, I think we're still striving for them today, many decades later. But it's sort of showing how there is this sense of things changing in the 70s. And sort of going back to Mitchell's studio, and funnily enough, I was going to talk about a room of one's own, but you've done it, so I can skip that bit.
Sorry.
No, but it's amazing, because the studio for me, in thinking about this idea of abstraction as a form of proto-feminism, the studio is central to it, because having a space to create enables, gives the possibilities to become the artist you want to be. And that is a very contentious, in a way it is a contentious subject, because there were those who had it and those who didn't have it. And this, I know, is an incredibly famous image of Mitchell's, maybe one of the most famous. But there's something about it, her sitting, surrounded, you lose complete sight of the space. She becomes the work and the work is her. And that to me is a very strong statement of being, and being an artist. She often in her interviews uses the phrase lady painter, which I find incredible. Here she's like a lady painter in charge of her space. And, in thinking through the idea of abstraction is not just about form, there is a sentence that comes up in an interview that Mitchell did with Cindy Nanser, which I found it really made me think. Because she says that her work is not just about impasto and the building up of color. What's important to her is form. And I think sometimes the way we think about form is reductive. We think of it just purely as shapes and forms, but actually there is intention in form. There is concept in form. And that is something that many artists, many artists of her generation, in the intention they put in form, is where to me sits the feminist in them that maybe they didn't even acknowledge. It's again this idea of that presence. And partly the reason why I'm saying this and why I've been thinking about this is because a year ago, as Eleanor was mentioning in her introduction, I curated a show which was about abstraction and women in the period between 1950 and the sort of late 1960s, and it was very deliberate because it was again thinking what was that moment after the Second World War where many women were actually occupied in activities that gave them jobs and a form of emancipation, and then the second wave feminist movements. And that's really where I started thinking about this form and the concept that I'm reconnecting now to Mitchell, the idea of this form with intention. And, you know, I'll just say one thing. I mean, this is not the focus of our conversation today, but it will help you understand what I meant by Mitchell in the studio. The work that's hanging over there was done by the Italian artist Marisa Merz. And the reason why it's hanging, essentially, is because she was working at her kitchen table, and in the evening, she had to use that table to serve dinner for her family. And so it had to go somewhere, and the somewhere was on the ceiling. And this is the moment, this is that generation where women artists are very much having to find a way in between, you know, the domestic sphere, the artistic sphere, and the independence. And one thing that struck me as I was reading through the many great material that Sarah shared with us is in my, and I'm not, and like Cora, I'm not a specialist on Mitchell, but in my imagination, she was always like a beacon of one of the ones who had really made it. Like she had broken through, she had been successful, she had a space of her own. But what struck me in reading the interviews is often she sort of also brings into play the sort of like domestic sphere that she's having to compete with. She says she's taking care of your pals, the housekeeping, the chores, the children. She reflects on what it means to be a lady painter, how challenging it is. Your work is being sold at half of the price. She's very much, there is a real sense of awareness of that challenge and that struggle. And I think in that, to me, is where, even though probably she might hate me for saying this, like, I do see the feminist in her, in raising that kind of visibility to the issues that women had. And I'm just going to end on something that I found, again, completely brilliant. And the other great discovery for me has been her amazing sense of humor. She is, like, incredible. Like, the kind of person you would want to sit there while she drinks her scotch and, like, hear her talk. But she's, in one of these interviews, she's sort of reflecting on what it means to be a woman alongside a male artist, which is the conundrum that so many women faced in those days. And she's also reflecting on how many women have to quit the idea of being an artist when they become a mother. And she says, if they don't quit, I always tell them, certainly not to marry an artist. My lord, that's lethal. And to get a doctor, lawyer, merchant, a bit older, who can pay for the canvas, come on, let's use them for something. And even though it's said in such an ironic way, I like to think this is a feminist quip. Thank you.
The book is here, as you could see, Action Gesture Painter. It's an exhibition that took place in 3 different institutions. One of them was Whitechapel, and the other one is Vincent van Gogh Foundation, where I was working. And I wanted to somehow start with this, because I'm a curator. And I want to start with this because, Camille, you said something very interesting about your exhibition in Pompidou. Joan Mitchell was the first one you were thinking about. And for this exhibition, which had more than 150 artists, women artists, women, like to say Griselda Pollock, Joan Mitchell was also the first one. But actually she was the first one to put in relation to 2 other groups, I would say. One group was the one you might know, which is characterizing the second wave of Abex, Grace Hartigan, Helen Frankenthaler. And the other group is not a group, is a man, Vincent van Gogh. And I wanted to take this opportunity of tonight to go back to this exhibition, to go back to many things as well, to the wonderful archives we could access, but also to wonder how could we be feminist with Van Gogh? and what an exhibition is doing, and what are the things she's not able to do. As you know, it's a language, and you have to bring an audience into a history. And as far as I'm concerned, I didn't know all the friendship, I would say, with Grace Hartigan and Helen Frankenteller. I don't know if you know even Grace Hartigan here. But I think it was important for us to start with, in this exhibition, as you can see, I mean, Lee Krasner is on the left side, so I'm going to contradict myself. Lee Krasner being a part of the, let's say, the first wave, the first part of the ABEX. But the exhibition had to outline a sort of cohesive unit within women, between women, among the ABEX movement, which was, as you could imagine, male-dominated, based mainly in New York. The feminist reading of that exhibition was to bring this cohesive unity between what the Times would call the vocal ladies. The vocal ladies, I don't know if you have in mind the picture of Grace Hartigan, Joan Mitchell, and Helen Frankenteller sitting together, a black and white picture by Glynn. You have it, they're laughing on the sofa, they're having a good time, and you feel like the friendship between them is really strong. It was at the opening of a Frankenteller solo exhibition. And as opposed to Lee Krasner of the first wave of ABEX, those three ladies had, I would say, the privilege, but also the paradox, to be able to play with the image, but an image of self-fulfilled woman, which will be achieving herself as an artist, and also as a woman, for some of them married. And I think there were some not confusion, but paradox between them. Grace Hartigan and Helen Frankenteller saying, "Oh my gosh, why did we get married? You know, I wish we had this bohemian lifestyle." And they were referring to Joan Mitchell, who was married, but was having this bohemian lifestyle. Which was not a bohemian, just the fact that she left New York was already bohemian, you see. She was able to confront herself with European painters. Van Gogh will be one of them. She was able to live, in different friendships in Paris. So the bohemian lifestyle was actually referring to her, living the New York art scene, but being, despite all of that, highly attached to that scene, to the New York school. And but so the reputation of them, showing themselves, the image, as I said, being on a picture. I thought you had this picture in mind, otherwise I would have put it here. It's really striking. It's an image of them, being more liberated, sexually maybe as well liberated, single, isolated maybe, as you said, for different reasons, but also they wanted to play this, persona in these art scenes, which also was a way to embrace or exemplify, but I think my colleague will respond to me in the questions, the Betty Friedman books in 1963, The Feminine Mystic. And as you know, The Feminine Mystic is a book that encouraged women to go beyond the feminine mystic, so to go out of the household parameters and stuff like that. So they were also, I think, not trying to mimic this, but of course it was a part of this context. But I realized during the research for today's talk that actually the support was not coming so much from Grace Hartigan and Frankenteller for Joan Mitchell. And I was struck because we lied in the exhibition. We were putting a group of paintings, I'm gonna stay here, of Joan Mitchell, two Joan Mitchell here, one Lee Krasner, next to that room you will have Grace Hartigan, or actually the opposite wall, and Helen Frankenteller. And Hélène de Kooning, which was, as a part of this group, was actually a great admirer and friend of Joan Mitchell, and she would get much more support from her. So what I was telling, what an exhibition cannot do, well actually this is one of the stories we could not actually explore further. The other thing we managed to acknowledge, and I'm very happy you're here, Regina, because even though women were mainly dismissed of course, Grace Hartigan, Ellen Franken-Teller, Joan Mitchell had a bit of acknowledgement. One being maybe the only artist as a part of an exhibition, for instance. Grace Hartigan was a part of the exhibition, the New American Painting. Which was first at the Museum of Modern Art, and then was traveling in Europe. And funnily, you know that this exhibition was promoted by the CIA. It was a highly diplomatic, geopolitical tool to show the creative freedom of American artists. And I was thinking, wow, it's interesting that we're actually speaking today about feminism, but the ideology behind Abex is actually commanding art history from male-dominated but also New York-based point of view, and the promotion of it was actually also a political device against, a Sovietic communist recent past. So the woman's storyline was also encapsulated as housewife, as opposed to Laura Smith actually speaking about this in the book, if you want to explore this, as opposed to the Sovietic industrious woman. So, it's interesting to just bear in mind this ideology of an exhibition like this one, which was promoted by the Central Intelligence Agency, which was created just a few years before. And even though Grace Hartigan was a part of this exhibition, most of them were actually dismissed. And hence the importance of what Griselda Pollock called corrective exhibition. Corrective exhibitions for her is not necessarily positive. We did a corrective exhibition, the Action Just Paint traveling exhibition is a corrective exhibition. Corrective exhibitions feels obliged to re-include artist women by all women's shows, or to show what were supposedly the cohesive unit between, let's say, the vocal ladies, Grace Hartigan, Ellen Franken-Teller, Joan Mitchell, but also trying to bring other players. And I go back to why I'm here, I'm happy you're here, with Regina from the Guggenheim, because one of the ladies that could also promote those first solo shows of women were Peggy Guggenheim, of course, and Betty Parson, if you know her, which opened the galleries in the 40s. And Betty Parson was also an artist herself, and her paintings were present in this exhibition. So we could tell the storylines with the painting, of course, of women supporting women. Janet Sobel having, the first exhibition at the gallery of Betty Parson. And then comes a man, the only man of the show. Van Gogh. And I mentioned Griselda Pollock and mentioned her for the corrective exhibition. The typology is that she's at the same time promoting, of course, but criticizing. And Joan Mitchell was first with Van Gogh. And I think I was myself kind of angry at that time after visiting the Monet Joan Mitchell exhibition, because we knew that Joan Mitchell, of course, liked Monet, but not as much as she would like Van Gogh, So it was like, let's not forget someone's story here, please. Cézanne, Matisse, of course, but Van Gogh was really, I think, for the light. One of the reasons was the light in Vincent Van Gogh Earth was really important. Monet did not have that light that she's actually trying to capture. How can we be feminist with Van Gogh? Aha, that's a full debate, and I'm sure I'm not going to be able to respond to it, and I will leave my colleague from the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam to respond to her exhibitions. But let's open one discussion on that if you want. Griselda Pollock did, feminist theorist, she did her PhD on Van Gogh in the late 70s. One thing she mentioned that Van Gogh by the 30s was dismissed. Van Gogh, I would say, sort of coming back in the international imagination was during the time of the rise of Abstract Expressionism, with two films, the Minelli films and the René films. So the dates, I should know that I've been working with the Van Gogh Foundation, but you know who it is. Alain René film, Van Gogh, 48, and Vincent Minelli, just for like 56. So And those films were released alongside the rise of abstract expressionism. Well, the reason is that the logic behind the mystification of, let's say, an outsider genius is for Griselda Pollock the same sort of processes by which you kind of erase women from artist history. And that it would be good to stop looking at artist to artist, but to look more at art speaking to art. And I think when you go through someone like Joan Mitchell, you're actually rediscovering Van Gogh as an artist speaking to another artist and not having art historian or critic point of view, bringing importance on the personal life of the painter to understand what's been going on in the painting. As you probably know, the late period by Van Gogh are the more abstract one. The late period being Saint-Rémy and Auvers-sur-Oise, and actually I'm showing here a painting by Saint-Rémy. So the late period of Van Gogh 1 year before his life are the more interesting when we are speaking about abstraction expressionism, because the sort of figure dilutes itself in a composition which is very vitalistic, but also maybe will lead the way to what we would call, a post-war abstraction. So Van Gogh being maybe a pioneer of the abstraction, that's just expressionist abstraction. The fact that Joan Mitchell was looking at some of his paintings across the Whitfields, the Nobles painting by Joan Mitchell, if you have it, it's like the sort of invasion of black brushstroke, which could be a sort of translation of the Van Gogh last painting. But she's not, we cannot lend any symbolic lecture to her, reading to her painting. It's much more than that. And she said, actually, also in terms of expressionism, because we are speaking about Van Gogh in this lineage, the feelings for her, if we have to speak about feelings, the feelings are not coming as a will to sort of self-express herself. They come from the landscape. And there are beautiful moments in which Linda Norling speaks about the feelings coming from remembered landscape. And I think it's what she is bringing to me when I'm looking at Van Gogh, that the feelings or the emotional response to a landscape might not be only situated in the person, and I think she's kind of dismissing that, the importance of the self and the celebration of the self and the self-expressive. She's not at ease with the expressionist term, but it comes from always bounced back to the landscape. And the idea of how she remembers the landscape. That's how she feels the feelings, as Marcia Tuckers puts the phenomenological plane. Sorry for that. So much more described within the landscape. So the phenomenology and not only the self-expressive. And I think this is going through Griselda or going through Joan Mitchell, looking now at Van Gogh. It's also liberating him and me from reading it as an outsider, marginalized artist who just had to put his anger into the painting. I'm going to stop there.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, so I'm the last speaker today. Thank you so much to the entire team of AWARE and the Joan Mitchell Foundation for the very kind invitation to be part of this distinguished panel. And it's very interesting that both Flavia and Cora talked about a room of her own, because I think in my presentation, as I can see already Carolina smiling, it's all going to come a little bit full circle, and we haven't discussed this in advance, so this is very interesting. As you can see in the title of my presentation is One Painting, One Room, Rethinking Joan Mitchell's Space in the Peggy Guggenheim Collection. So I come to you not as a scholar in the grand sense of Joan Mitchell, but as a curator at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection. where we have exactly one painting by Joan Mitchell. It is this wonderful 1962 canvas from the Schulhof collection, which we received as a bequest in 2012, so about 13 years ago now. And so in some ways, this limited encounter might seem to restrict our institutional engagement with her work, but in other ways, it sharpens our focus. Because when you have only one painting, the choices about how and where you exhibit it become incredibly revealing. And so my talk today is about how Mitchell, through this painting, has been historically framed in our institution since its arrival, and how in 2027, in 2 years' time, this work will help anchor a small, but I believe also long overdue shift in how we present her to the public. And that's where we'll come to the room of her own. So it is a shift not only of space, but of perspective, towards what I believe is a feminist curatorial lens, even if not labeled as such. Since even the smallest curatorial gestures can be part of a broader feminist rethinking of how we present and understand artists like Mitchell, of reinterpreting the narratives that we inherit. Since arriving at the Peggy Guggenheim collection, this work has been exhibited alongside male postural figures, such as William de Kooning and Franz Klein. And here, oh, this is the slide. Yes, you can see Mitchell exhibited exactly opposite the Kooning painting from the 1960s, from the same Schulhof collection. And so these are artists that Mitchell herself cited as her influences in interviews, including her 1974 conversation with Marcia Tucker, and she also called them marvelous painters in the film by Marion Cajori. We've also shown her alongside Hans Hofmann, whom she knew, and she also attempted to attend his classes, but she very famously said she couldn't understand a word of what he was saying, so she didn't continue. And particularly in the 1950s, she was deeply embedded in the group that came to be known as Abstract Expressionism. Or to paraphrase Mitchell herself, simply artists who happened to live in the same place at the same time. So in her own words, these men were nice to her because she was not a threat to any of them. And she admired also, beyond them, early abstract paintings by artists like Vasily Kandinsky, who is also represented in our collection. And then there is, of course, Jean-Paul Riopelle. So our panel today is concentrated on the 1960s and 1970s. And during that period, as I think many of you know, Mitchell would remain together with Riopelle, particularly at that time. And as she called him in her interviews, in fact, with Linda Nochlin, her 24-year live-in. And so she moved to France permanently in 1959, as she later mentioned, and I quote, "Because you do what the man wants," end quote, because of Riopelle. While we have one Riopelle work in our permanent collection and we showed it alongside our Mitchell painting, we specifically decided not to show her work in this 2027 show as a deliberate gesture, although she didn't deny his influence. Later in her life, she admitted of their relationship, I quote, "I think women are inclined more often than men to be self-destructive. I should have cut, left sooner," end quote. So Mitchell has long been shown alongside this boy, so to say, in our collection. Respected, yes, but often positioned in relation to them. I'm not saying it is wrong to do this, since Mitchell herself did not want to be considered apart from her male colleagues. Yet this reflects a broader historiographic trend in which so-called abstract expressionism was long written, taught, and exhibited as a movement by men with women orbiting around them. Mitchell was present, but not given enough room. And so that will change in 2 years' time when we open a new exhibition on post-American and European art, primarily drawn from the Guggenheim collections, but also enriched with additions from private collections. For the first time in our Venetian Museum's history, Mitchell will have an entire room to herself, or a room of her own. Just 3 or 4 paintings, and they span 4 decades from the 1940s to the 1980s. And this is not a retrospective, but it is something more pointed, a deliberate spatial and conceptual intervention. To dedicate a room of her own, especially within the walls of a museum historically associated with a largely male canon, is not simply an act of inclusion, it's an act of reframing. For the first time, the space will allow viewers to engage with her work on its own terms and to trace a longer, more complex arc of her artistic career, one that includes her earliest experiments and her late radiant canvases. This may sound like a simple curatorial decision, yet it represents for us a significant shift. It's about how we show women artists, not just if we show them. This kind of curatorial work is deeply influenced by feminist methodologies, which teach us to interrogate institutional frameworks, how they construct authority, visibility, and value. Mitchell, whose career unfolded during the height of second wave feminism, resisted the label of feminist artist. Her reluctance was real, but so too was her accurate awareness of the gender structures shaping her reception. As she revealed to Marcia Tucker, and I quote, "Never occurred to me that I'd make big time because I'm a woman," unquote. And so although Mitchell often worked alone in her studio, her practice was deeply shaped by an ongoing dialogue with other artists. In New York, in Paris, in Béthune, she understood that creative exchange was essential. These conversations helped sustain and enrich her work. Beyond her engagement with male contemporaries that I talked about today, she was also part of a complex and dynamic network of women artists. Some of these relationships were close, others were marked by high tension. Friendships with figures like Grace Hartigan, also represented in our collection, and Helen Frankenthaler, who will be part of our show in 2027, these had largely faded by the 1970s, the period our concentration today. This reflected also the competitive and exclusionary nature of the post-war art world, where opportunities for women were limited, and solidarity was often difficult to sustain, with only a handful of gallery spaces available to female artists. So Mitchell confided in Marcia Tucker, and I quote, "Only people alongside Elaine de Kooning who helped me were men. All women were against other women," end quote. And that's especially in the olden days, which for her were the 1950s. And since still, Mitchell maintained enduring connections with artists and such as Shirley Jaffe and Zuka Mittenberg in the later decades, both of whom, like her, relocated to France. Later in her career, she also became an advocate for emerging artists, and I think this is especially important. She was a huge advocate for many women artists, and especially women whose reputations had not yet been firmly established. She offered encouragement to American painters like Cora Cohen, Ellen Lanyon, Joyce Pensato, as well as French artists including Michael Andrea Chart and Frédéric Lucien. Perhaps acknowledging these relationships is part of a feminist methodology, one that reminds us that women artists existed within a broader ecosystem of mutual support, competition, influence, and resistance. So though Mitchell never joined feminist collectives, her interviews and letters reflect a nuanced understanding of gender dynamics. She seems to have been deeply aware of what it meant to be a woman artist in a world that is still defining greatness in masculine terms. In her conversation with Linda Nochlin, she admitted, and I quote, "When I was discouraged, I wondered if women really couldn't paint, the way that all the men said that they couldn't. But in other times I said, F them, you know?" End quote. So that tension between internalized doubt and fierce defiance echoes throughout her work and her life. Her 1965 interview with Dorothy Sackler reinforces this ambivalence. Mitchell said, "I don't want to be a success. I just want to paint," end quote. And so she also said to Betty Hess, and I quote, sorry, there are many quotes, but I think they're important, "Feminism doesn't make you want to paint. To sit there and think about feminism, it's such a non-visual," end quote. And so it is about painting, on painting that we want to concentrate in our museum when we dedicate that room to her. She wanted freedom from systems of valuation that never made space for someone like her. She wanted her paintings to be enough. And through our room dedicated to Mitchell, we want to give space to them. Her works that reflected her feeling that came from the outer world. Feeling of landscape, feeling of water, trees, and their memory. Landscape as a full experience, as I think Sarah very beautifully put it in one of the videos on the foundation website. And so in Mitchell, I believe, we see a woman intensely aware of how the world perceives her. Aware that she is, in her own words, hard to place. She rejects the idea of being a woman artist, but she's painfully aware how gender shaped her reception. So that's a contradiction at the heart of Mitchell's relationship with feminism. She didn't want the label, but she lived the consequences of its absence. And as the feminist movement gained visibility in the 60s and 70s, its frameworks and its questions surrounded Mitchell constantly. So she was in dialogue, even if she didn't name it as such. So what do we as curators do with all of this? We must stun her, not by explaining away her contradictions, but by creating space for her. As I showed today, I believe we start small, and we start close to the work itself. But by giving a room of her own, and by bringing together works from different moments of her life, we hope to create a space that honors the complexity of her position. Importantly, a position as an artist who made room for her own truth. So it really is about her and her own truth. And in closing, I just want to recall the 1981 exhibition curated by Jane Livingston at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And it was an exhibition that showcased works by 5 American artists. Richard Diebenkorn, Richard Serra, Frank Stella, Agnes Martin, and Mitchell herself. And so the selection of artists reflected a diverse range of approaches to abstraction and American art at the time. Interestingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, Mitchell expressed a deeper affinity with Agnes Martin's artistic vision than any other artist on view. She later remarked that she felt more connected to Martin's presence, and I quote, because of its precise, sensitive, sensual abstraction, end quote. And coincidentally, even prior to finding out about Mitchell's feelings regarding Martin, we will also be showing Agnes Martin in a room of her own in that very same exhibition in 2027. So I would like to think or hope that Mitchell would have appreciated that. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for those brilliant presentations. Eleanor and I are going to start off with just a couple of questions. We were meant to panel this for a little longer, but we really want to prioritize the audience. You must have so many questions after such brilliant interventions. So I'll go ahead and begin with the first question. That is just taking us back to the theme of this panel, which is Joan Mitchell and the second wave feminism. And I wanted to ask you all, how did Joan Mitchell describe or frame her own career trajectory in light of the second wave feminist discourse? And to what extent might feminist conversations of the early 1970s or throughout the 1970s have heightened her consciousness of gendered mechanisms, even as she resisted being labeled as a feminist artist?
I'm sorry. I seem to not be able to use microphones this evening. So I think that's a really interesting question, and one I'd like to turn back to Mitchell's own words for. So it's in an interview, in 1974, she participates, I find this really striking, in the early 70s, mid-70s, there's sort of a spate of sort of feminist projects she participates in. So she subscribes to the Feminist Art Journal, an article by Cindy Nems is published there. She also gets interviewed by Kate Horsfield and Lynn Blumenfeld. And in that same interview with Horsfield and Blumenfeld, who are doing a feminist art project of interviewing different women artists, she talks about how in the 70s, all of a sudden, abstract painting was looked at again. You know, an abstract painting, it had been forgotten about, and women artists had been forgotten about. And there was this moment of thinking about how her work had gained a lot of attention. And I think it's quite interesting to think about Mitchell as a feminist in that context, that like, you know, abstract painting is associated by that time with a very heroic, with a very kind of anachronistic mode. And to me, Mitchell's feminism almost comes from her continuous desire to resist categories. You know, she ironically describes herself as an abstract expressionist old hat and a lady painter. And I think that is really where her feminism is. It's in this refuting of any kind of category. And in a moment of the 70s where painting is first seen to die, she keeps on painting. Sarah and I were talking about this earlier, and I think it's quite interesting how a lot of the words that we say associate with feminism in kind of a behavioural sense, confidence, defiance, irreverence, all of these ideas really resonate with Mitchell. So while she wasn't necessarily declaring I am a feminist, I think more widely that relates to her kind of rejection of the conceptual, or rejection of kind of big public declarations. She wasn't an artist who really did that. But instead we can think about feminism and her work in the context of the 1970s in terms of like a behavioural mode, and in terms of a structural mode, and a sense of real irreverence in terms of how she lived and worked.
Well, I hope I've answered from her presentation, but it's literally, I think she leveraged it all. You know, she wanted to concentrate on her work more than anything, but she was deeply aware of the mechanisms, and all the issues and discourses surrounding her. So more than anything, from all the interviews, from the 16th, 70s, and later, we recognize that very, very deep awareness. And I just wanted to reference something that Sarah had said in the beginning when you introduced the talk today. I think you mentioned the Whitney exhibition, right, the 1974, that in the beginning Mitchell didn't want to be pushed forward, right, as a kind of this, used as a woman artist token, essentially, by the Whitney Museum. And I read somewhere that at that point it was like this, but shortly afterwards she started subscribing to the newsletters dedicated to women artists, right? And of course we now focus support also of younger women artists at the time that became even more prominent than it earlier had been. So she certainly was aware of everything that was taking place, and I think even at some point in the interview with Linda Nochlin, she does, was it with Betty Hess? Yes, that in the beginning she refused the feminist label, but later she said, well, I'm alright, I'm a feminist. Almost out of anger saying it. So she was very aware of all that was taking place, and I think, subscribe to certain issues. It was more about leveraging her position at about that time that was important.
Thank you. I think something that has been abundantly clear is there are frequent contradictions between what Mitchell says, maybe at one point in time, maybe even then within the next minute or in the next few years. I think that's an inherently human thing. We grow, we learn, we contradict ourselves. But also between her words and then her actions. So for example, saying, she doesn't want to show in women group shows, but then actually showing, etc. And one question that we had is, how do those frequent contradictions between these statements and actions, or between these statements and within themselves, function as a deliberate strategy, actually to blur public perception, to keep a kind of very private image, and to maintain autonomy in her work? I wonder, Flavia, if you might take that on.
It's a great question, and as you said, it's an inherently human trait. And it's sort of, in a way, it's also second-guessing someone. But I do think that a lot of artists, generally, and this has been said by others, there's a real resistance on the part of so many artists to subscribe to any specific category, be it political or artistic. I do think also that now we're seeing feminism with the benefit of 50 years on. And I also wonder whether some of that came from just trying to understand what it meant, and also trying to understand what it meant within the gendered framework that Regina has beautifully explained that she was having to compete with on a daily basis. And so I think it's maybe, that's also where it might feel blurry, because probably it did feel blurry. It wasn't as crisp and neat as we can see it now. It was something in the making. And sometimes we forget that because we have the benefit of so much knowledge. And so that's also how I read some of that. I think maybe there is, and also I guess just from the level of humor, maybe sometimes it's also pushing slightly against the grain. It makes me angry, on the cusp. But so I think it's both that, but it's also the sense of seeing what develops and how it develops. No others have.
I can briefly build on that. So I think Mitchell and privacy is quite an interesting question in terms of her relationship with the audience. So Harry Goff says Mitchell was a very private person, and she only painted for herself and her dogs. And Mitchell makes that pronouncement again and again and again. She sees her audience as her dogs rather than a public. And what I find striking is that when we think about Mitchell saying that, or when we think about Mitchell and humour, I think it's an in-joke that she's making in her paintings. It sort of requires, it requires you to know a level of her work, and she wants the work to only be defined on her own terms. And I think that's where the humour aspect comes in. It's not painting for a public. She says that the broom, broom, broom is in the studio, this is where I am alive. It's not about making art for everyone. It's about making art on her own terms. And in rejecting an audience, again, I think we can think of that as a feminist principle. In the context of the 1970s and in the context of second wave feminism, or even in the fact she remains committed to oil painting as a very historic mode of painting, I think this idea of privacy and this idea of rejecting a public is about taking control of her art and ensuring the terms of it are kind of precisely on the ones that Mitchell wanted it to be, even for with the contradiction that came with that.
It's and when you see that most of the paintings are, you know, moments of friendship, are dedicated to friends or passing friends or even her dogs, and there's an interesting moment, I think, is a Linda Nochlin text where it's all about manipulation of the direct environment you have. Manipulation as, you know, transformation, and I think this environment is of course landscape. She is, again, as we say, you know, away from New York, but it's also this environment which is in the environment of the friendship. So I think this privacy also comes with the landscape, but also with, you know, the person who are surrounding her. So it's something which I found interesting with her when she calls herself a traditionalist. And I see the irony that you're describing in that, like sort of advocating that, you say, I'm a traditionalist, and it's this commitment to all painting and everything. And I think it's also a way to assert that painting comes first, and that the painting takes place in this environment that she's actually reflecting upon, manipulating in for the experience of the mark making and so on. So.
Great, thank you. So the next question we had was about Joan Mitchell in relation to being an American in Paris. She often recounted an anecdote of a French art dealer who said to her, "Oh Joan, if only you weren't a woman and American, if only you were French and male and dead, I would give you a shot." How might her choice to move to France have doubly marginalized her in terms of gender and nationality, or inversely, have been a choice to be seen as an American artist, not a woman artist?
Well, in the exhibition Action Gesture Painter, I did not have time to speak about one slide. Is Niki de Saint-Phal. We put her in the same room. They were not friends, but I think they were something like an anecdote. I mean, they were not friends. Let's put it differently. They met. Obviously, they met. Joan Mitchell doesn't really speak about her, as far as I know, but Niki de Saint-Phal speaks about Joan Mitchell, being a part of this American artist. So I think for your responding to your question is also depending on who is responding to that question. And as far as Niki de Saint-Phal is concerned, what I can say is actually that she really felt that the will to continue being an artist was actually coming from her meeting Joan Mitchell as an autonomous, strong artist, American artist, and that's actually one of the inspirations for her. Which, of course, it's a completely footnote, I would say, for most of the people, but that's an exhibition which actually can do when you bring them together. That's one way to respond to it.
Comments? Let me just add something briefly. I'm also reminded of another phrase to add to what you were saying. In the film by Marion Cajori, I think at some point she says, well, you know, in France, I'm perceived to be this American lyrical painter. But then in America, I'm perceived to be this French decorative artist, essentially. And then I'm a woman as well.
Yeah.
So kind of she almost doesn't quite fit in any context, you know, not just France, you know, thinking. So for her, it was just about doing what she was doing and doing as best as she can, essentially beyond all these discourses and not thinking of where she belongs. Yeah.
To kind of build on that, I think a really interesting tension that runs through Mitchell's life and her work is this tension between feeling like she's on the outside and on the end. So there's a really kind of poignant quote she makes in an interview with Michael Brenson with 3 older American women artists, where Mitchell says, "I feel I'm on the outside looking in like the little matchstick girl," and that's in reference to the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale story. But I think when we think about Mitchell on the outside looking in terms of the Parisian context or in terms of this dialogue with New York, I think Mitchell sees herself and actively courts her position on the outside. And I find that really interesting. So she identifies continuously with abstract expressionism after the so-called death of painting, but she positions herself on the outside of every grouping. She moves away from New York, while also being on the outside enabled her to sort of paint in solitude and paint in isolation. And maybe isolation's a term that we can sort of hang out with for a little bit, because traditionally when we think about isolation or solitude in art history, we think about sort of great male painter working in the private space of the studio. But I think for Mitchell, that isolation, or to go back to a lot of what we all talked about, that taking on the studio almost became a feminist act. So to claim isolation as a feminist term, or when Linda Nochlin goes to visit her at Victoria, she talks about how quiet and how isolated and how silent it was. And so maybe there's something feminist in Mitchell moving away from all these contexts and desiring to be contextualized or spatialized purely in her own terms on the outside.
Thank you. If there are still no questions, yeah, great. Yeah, so I had a question mostly related also to the mentioning of Kandinsky and magical surrealism, because recently I've been like interested in also like womanist and feminist spirituality in the 70s, and I was wondering if maybe Joan Mitchell also has some link to it, also like as a surrealist painting, maybe interested in transcendence or something. Maybe you guys know?
Not that I know of. Well, yeah, Kandinsky is one thing, of course, and spirituality, but then surrealism is a whole different movement. Yeah, I did a show, yes, on surrealism and magic, but I haven't found kind of intersections between Joan Mitchell and surrealism. Maybe Sarah or Krista would be able to answer it better.
No, I wouldn't say surrealism, but she was very interested in Mondrian, and that there's sort of that aspect of spiritualism. When she was in New York in the 40s, she spent time looking at Mondrian collection at the Guggenheim.
But not surrealism, right? I haven't found any.
Yeah, and it's not a topic that comes up in letters or conversation and any real references to spirituality.
What a great question. Thank you. Thank you.
I may have kind of an open question. Because Joan Mitchell's work has recently been studied through different new perspectives, which is feminism, her relationship to the feminist movement, as you spoke about today, but also to other women artists of her generation, then the generation that was after, to men artists of her generation and generations before. And it's an open question. I was wondering if there is any other perspective that has not been developed yet, and that you think still maybe related to gender also, that still is waiting for you.
Can I
you
answer
have
that question?
Yeah.
So I'm aware that this panel is focused on the 60s and the 70s, but I was really struck by what you were saying earlier about how artists are in dialogue with artists. And to your question about, if you think about the relationships between Joan Mitchell and artists, who came after, or artists of her generation, but coming from my own place in historical research, I think about the group of women artists who were exhibiting, who were just half a generation or a generation before Joan Mitchell, who served as a type of model of what a woman artist looked like in this extremely male-dominated world of New York painting. And Joan is in dialogue with those women as well as the men. And so many of these women, whether it's Irene Rice Pereira, Betty Parsons was mentioned, Alice Trimble Mason, and selfishly, for me as a historian of Hedda Stern, these are all artists who would have, I think, been quite well noticed by Joan Mitchell, by Grace Hardigan, by Helen Frankenthaler, and much less often acknowledged as certain forms of influence, as certain, I don't know, I'll stop there because I'm curious about this idea of the context. That there is another example of women painters who Joan Mitchell is in dialogue with that comes forward and who have very similar trajectories of taking a step back from public life at a particular point in their lives, turning to the fully private, and noticing how
Joan Mitchell, Helen Frankfurter, Grace Hart again have this contextualization within abstract expressionism in an easier way than the women Lee Krasner maybe accepted, who are just a little bit older. But I would include Elaine de Kooning in that. Not a question.
Great comment.
That's a good comment.
Yeah, of course. I think we'll do this question, then one more, and then we'll.
We organized, there was this book that was published recently about Joan Mitchell and her dogs. And we organized a talk at the David Zwerner Gallery. And I was curious because we have so many specialists in the room. At the time, because of her relationship with the dogs and how she titled so many of her paintings to her dogs, and they were really such a huge, important part of her life. At the time, during the talk that we organized, it was kind of this understanding that the dogs were a way of not being in relationship with humans, and so the isolation was more as almost like a misanthrope kind of vision of life. And I really liked what you were saying about her isolation becoming something more as an act of feminism, and I was wondering if you had anything to back up that, or if there was any further information that we have about if it's one or the other, or if it's both, or in her isolation.
The isolation was a feminist act, or that the isolation, or that the dogs? Or...
No, that the dog. I mean, at the time, the dogs were kind of explaining the isolation as something, isolating her from humans.
I understand.
And I was wondering, between that and just the reason as the isolation being a feminist act, what would be?
I think that so the question is kind of about how the dogs and the isolation kind of connect in a kind of bigger point.
Yeah.
And I like this question, and it's something I kind of talk a little bit about in my Joan Mitchell, in the chapter for my PhD on Joan Mitchell. I think it's about a wider rejection of the audience, and I think that's fundamentally what it's about. Mitchell rejected the audience in many, many ways. So she rejected the audience in that when she painted, the only beings she would allow to be with her were her dogs. No one else was allowed to watch her paint. And she talked about how the dogs would understand the classical music she was playing. And I think a lot of it comes, it goes back to the thing I talk about a lot, but I think humour is a huge part of it. And the rejection of the audience. And I think these two things really do go hand in hand. And that, Mitchell is an artist who we need to take very seriously. Her paintings are very serious. They're really scholarly, abstract paintings. But they're also paintings she wanted to not really be able to be defined. So I think there's a great, Helen Moldsworth wrote this really beautiful essay on painting and ambivalence, where she says that paintings that are afflicted by feminism and are also abstract always come down to the condition of illegibility. And I think that's sort of how we get between the dogs and the audience, which is that Mitchell wanted her paintings to kind of be not legible. She wanted her paintings to be knotty and hard to grapple with, and in painting for her dogs and in working in isolation, all of this is about making an art that could only be defined in her own terms. And if we go back to a kind of wider conversation around the woman artist, I think that something that happened, very often women artists' work was taken out of their own terms. Language, was taken away. That a painting we read in many, many different ways. So the overemphasis, for example, on Monet is a good example of this in Mitchell's work. But I think that by making these works and by rejecting the audience, she's sort of trying to take back language. She's trying to kind of contextualize it and not have a whole kind of discourse of this means this or this is this, and it's rejecting other sort of structures of knowledge, which I find quite an interesting way of thinking about Mitchell. And I hope that answers your question. Thank you so much. Thank you. Anyone else want to build on that?
I have a question for you.
Do we have a last question? Okay, well, in that case, I think we should wrap up and have some food and a bit to drink. And if you have any more questions for our wonderful panel, feel free to approach them when you've got a glass in hand, and maybe it'll be a bit less of an kind of intimidating environment.
And just to add that we'll be projecting two of Joan Mitchell's interviews, one that was mentioned with Kajori and Haas. So you'll see me running around, as I said, about the next few minutes. And I hope you enjoy. Please feel free to move in and out of the projection with your drinks. And yes, we can't wait to